Welcome everyone to this Introduction to Content Area Literacy first lecture for the course. I hope you will enjoy this course. I know that we've gotten off to a little bit of a slow start, but we'll try to make up for that. As you know, my name is Dr. William Kearns. This is my first year at University of Arkansas at Little Rock. Prior to this, I was an assistant professor of English education at Harris-Stowe State University. And I've also been an English teacher as well as a reading teacher, a reading specialist, and a curriculum coordinator in high schools in Central Florida. Okay, let's begin. Our first slide, building content knowledge and reading skill. The first thing that you want to do when you focus on content area literacy is I want you to realize this is not about are you a reading teacher, are you a content teacher? That's not what it's about. This is about being both. A student who struggles to read the text that you're presenting in a class is going to struggle with your material. To give you an example, when I was a reading specialist and a curriculum specialist in a high school in Central Florida, I was working with an English teacher who told me, this is before I was Dr. Kearns, this was when I was Mr. Kearns, that he's not a reading teacher, he's an English teacher, and he didn't want to teach basic reading skills to the students in his class who were struggling. Well, the reason his students were struggling with the material is that they were having a hard time comprehending the material. They were having a hard time with reading comprehension. And so if he had worked with the students on reading strategies, reading skills, they would have performed better in his English class. Same thing goes with other content areas. A student who struggles with understanding basic reading strategies with word problems in math might have a hard time answering those math word problems, and that can lead to a misdiagnosis. That can possibly lead to you thinking that the reason the student is struggling is because of math, when in fact that student might be struggling because of reading issues. So you want to help the student better understand what they read in the content area course. That means integrating reading, writing, talking, listening, and viewing. These are the different aspects of the English language arts in the related learning material. In other words, do it meaningfully. Do it in context. Don't do it in isolation. Help the learners in your classroom make connections between prior knowledge and new information when presented to them. That's called drawing on prior knowledge. That's called drawing on schema. We'll learn more about schema theory as we go along. And you want to teach students how to use reading as a tool for thinking and learning. You want to focus on reading strategies. This is a quick little introduction to some of the reading strategies you'll learn more about as we go through this course. Monitoring. In other words, this is what amounts to metacognition. Metacognition. Metacognition means strategically thinking about what you're doing as you're doing it. It means strategically thinking about whether you understand material, how to better understand material. Comprehension means, of course, understanding. I apologize for the phone. Let me shut that off. Comprehension means understanding what you read in the context of what you are reading. The ultimate goal of reading is to comprehend, of course. Pre-reading, that's previewing. What are the pictures? What are the reading cues? What can you gain from the headlines on a page? What can you predict? Setting goals. I want to understand this. I want to understand this. Here's what I want to accomplish in my reading. A skilled reader has goals. Using prior knowledge, again, that's drawing on schema. There's a theory in reading called the transactional theory of reading. This says that we bring our prior knowledge, our prior experiences into a text, and that prior knowledge, that prior experience shapes what we get out of a text. Every reader has a different experience with the text depending on their prior knowledge and their prior experience. Ask questions. Why is this happening? Why is a character doing something? Why am I understanding this math problem? Why am I not understanding that math problem? Make predictions about what you're reading and test those predictions. Reread if you're struggling. And of course, summarize what you're reading and have enough metacognition to be able to tell whether you are accurately summarizing or not. Close reading. I want you to watch this videotape that I've enclosed here. I'm doing this for a purpose. I don't want you to depend on me lecturing, and I don't want you to depend on articles and so on and so forth. I want you to see actual strategies and teaching approaches in action during this course. That's how you learn best. You learn best through modeling. Well, I want you to see good teaching being modeled for you in some of these videos. Close reading strategies means basically that you take a look at this text and you use these reading strategies that I just talked about to closely read the text instead of just simply skimming over the text in a nutshell. Disciplinary reading strategies. When we talk about disciplinary reading strategies, these are reading strategies that are specific to the content area that you are teaching. They can vary a little bit, or in some cases even more than a little bit, depending on your content area. You want to build specialized vocabulary. By specialized vocabulary, I mean the vocabulary that is specific to your content area. Math, for instance, has a different set of specialized vocabulary than English language arts or physics. It's very important for your students to know that vocabulary. Deconstruct complex sentences. That's extremely important. Your students should know how to build and take apart difficult sentences in very strategic ways so that they can get meaning out of that sentence. Break a sentence down into smaller parts so that they can understand a difficult word. Predict main ideas. What is this story saying? What is this story going to say if they're reading a work of literature? If they're reading a math text, what is the main idea that I'm probably going to expect to find in this math text that's teaching me about algebra or algebraic concepts? Predict subordinate ideas. Okay, so if I'm going to be learning about concepts in algebra, I can expect to learn about certain subordinate concepts that build the prior knowledge of how to do algebra. If a student is struggling on basic mathematical logic, then they're going to struggle on higher levels of math too, and this gets into reading. Same thing with science. They need to have subordinate ideas about scientific concepts in order to build higher levels of concepts in science. I know that many of you are teaching various subject areas, and that's okay. You will notice as I go through this class, I will try to get us into different strategies that are appropriate for different content areas. Disciplinary reading strategies. Here are some more disciplinary reading strategies that can vary depending on which content area we're talking about. You want to make sense of graphic representations. Obviously, if you're talking about science, you're going to have a specific set of graphic representations that apply here. Representations of the periodic table, if you're talking about chemistry. Representations of concepts in physics. Math absolutely has graphic representations that are critical to be able to understand. If you're teaching, for instance, basic statistics and introductory level statistics to students, they need to be able to understand box plots, for instance, which is a type of graphic representation. You want to be able to pose disciplinary relevant questions. What questions can I expect to have answered in this text? What do I understand? Why do I need to understand it? Why are they taking this certain approach in this textbook? That's extremely important for your readers to do. Remember, the key thing is you want your students to be strategic. You want your students to be purposeful. You want your students to have a sense of meaning in what you read. You want them to be able to compare claims and propositions against texts. If you're talking about texts that are arguing for a purpose, trying to persuade readers, you might have your readers read two different sets of arguments and compare and contrast the nature of the arguments that are being made and why the two authors are using one set of reasonings against another. And that's, of course, where you might want to study logical fallacies and so forth as they're doing that. You might want to study, for instance, the Toulmin method of logical argumentation. And here I'll write that in for you. I'm not the best at, I'm still learning how to work with the PowerPoint writing, so apologize for my sloppiness here. But Toulmin, that's an M. Again, Toulmin method of logical argumentation. If you're talking about persuasive claims, go ahead and look that up on your own. I'll post it for you and I'll email it for you later. Use norms for reasoning within the disciplinary to evaluate claims. Every discipline that we talk about will have a different set of norms. My wife, for instance, I've sent you details about my marriage because I consider it very important for you to get to know your professors. When I was teaching face-to-face classes more often back in my former university, we got to know each other. My wife has a tendency to teach a lot of statistics classes. For instance, she will oftentimes teach business statistics. Well, one reason why undergraduate students in our business stats class will tend to struggle is because they don't understand the norms of reasoning in her discipline. They might struggle with basic mathematical reasoning that comes from prior knowledge, prior teaching. Well, if you're struggling on basic disciplinary logic, you're going to have a really hard time when the teacher starts speeding up and when the teacher starts getting into more complex issues. That's true no matter what topic we're talking about. There's a basic set of norms for reasoning. Obviously, in science, you're talking about the scientific method. Your students need to understand the basic norm for reasoning in that. When we're talking about literature, we're talking about basic norms of reasoning that a literary critic would use. And if your students are going to think like a literary critic, they need to understand those norms of reasoning. Jerome Bruner, a famous social constructivist theorist in the field, likes to say that, and I'll write that down for you here, if you'll forgive my sloppiness in writing. Jerome, it's J-E-R-O-M, it's an M, sorry. Jerome Bruner. Still learning how to work with this. If my wife could see this, she'd laugh and she'd be embarrassed. Jerome Bruner. Okay, he's a famous Vygotskian theorist. Vygotskian, Lev Vygotsky, the famous Russian theorist, best known in psychology for the zone of proximal development and other concepts. Jerome Bruner liked to say that students need to learn early on, even in early elementary school, much less middle school and high school. They need to think the way that professionals in their field would think. If you're going to have a student learn math, they need to learn to think in the basic set of logical reasoning that a mathematician would think. That means taking on certain roles. If you're going to have them be learn science, then learn to think the way that a scientist would think. If you're going to study English writing, learn to think the way that a real writer would think as they're composing. If you have them do fiction writing, think the way that a fiction writer would think in terms of imagination, creativity, character development. Know what counts as evidence within a discipline. That's, of course, very important. We don't want our students to just simply take a talk show host mentality, in the worst sense of the term, where anything goes. There is certain evidence in every discipline area that's valid, that is reliable, and some evidence that's not valid, not reliable. Your students need to know the difference. Okay, so here's some key principles that we'll work on in this class. To successfully read texts in different content areas, students must develop discipline-specific skills and strategies along with knowledge of that discipline. Now, there are certain general reading strategies that we'll learn in this class that cut across disciplines. Strategies for how to break down complex words, strategies for how to work with word parts. For instance, obviously, knowledge of root words, that's where it can be important to know, for instance, Latin roots. When I was a student in high school and middle school, I remember studying Latin roots all the time and Greek roots. And that helps, knowing how to break a sentence down into different component parts. Those are general strategies, but there are also certain disciplinary strategies that can differ across disciplines. Math, for instance, might have certain strategies that can differ a little bit from strategies that might be as helpful in literature. And so you need to know these strategies too. You need to know ways that students read in physics, chemistry, algebra, and that they can, like I just said, differ from the way students read in English or history. A student not familiar with those reading strategies will really struggle in that. That's among the reasons why a student might have a hard time in physics, even if they do well in English. Now, that's a broad statement to say that's the only reason why, but it's among the possible reasons why. If they have the reading strategies down pat for English, but they don't have the reading strategies down for physics. In math, for example, students may need to become skilled in reading and rereading the same few lines of a text, which requires tolerance of intensity of close reading. And that's a very important thing, of course, in math, because if a student just simply reads a word problem or reads a challenging scenario real quickly, and then just simply skims over that and then starts trying to answer questions, it increases the likelihood that they're going to get confused. Some other key principles. You want to think about specific skills students need in order to read effectively in content areas. Again, think about your content area, think about what they do, think about thinking strategies, think about metacognition. What is it you want students to be doing and why? And it's not enough just to say, well, I gave you the information, you should understand it, what's wrong? Students need to be taught these skills, especially if they're struggling. Strategies that should be used to help students become more effective readers and independent learners need to be very systematically taught in schools. We cannot just simply assume that students know these strategies. In fact, if a student is a struggling reader, it's a pretty good bet that they likely do not know certain key reading strategies. And think, of course, about the type of learning environment that promotes effective reading and learning. That includes the color scheme in your room, that includes the rules, that includes how you talk to students, that includes your facial expressions, your tone of voice, that includes expectations for dialogue, that includes the way that students talk to each other, that includes whether you are an authoritarian or a coach type of teacher. We'll learn more about that later. Your learning environment makes a major, major difference. Build skills in the content area and literacy. Your skills related to issues contribute to difficulties students have with reading and writing in the content areas. What I mean by that is this, like I've been saying, If a student is struggling with the basic thinking skills as they think about how to go about breaking down a text and making meaning out of a text, it is going to have a major influence on their ability to comprehend the material in your content. Oftentimes, when I was a curriculum specialist walking through rooms, I would find that one reason students were struggling on science content is because the text in a science book was written above the current reading level of many students in that room. And that's among the reasons why you need to work on these strategies, because some of this vocabulary gets difficult in a hurry for our students. Many students have trouble understanding concepts in a text because they haven't learned how to mentally organize information as they read. That's called building schema. That's called categorizing information very purposefully. That's called being a strategic reader. We need to help students be more strategic. Building skills. Students may struggle with a text, for instance, in science, math, and English, because they have little or no experience with the topic. A student who has never tried to deal with concepts related to literary criticism, cultural criticism, different types of literary criticism, may struggle in a hurry when you start asking them to be a literary critic in your English class. If you're talking about science, a student who has a weak foundation on basic scientific principles and basic knowledge in science might struggle when you start teaching scientific concepts. Students may struggle with the text if they don't know how to make meaningful and personal connections with new ideas while reading, and that's very important. That's one reason why you want your examples to be things that they can relate to. You want hands-on learning. You want to have opportunities for students to put hands-on, minds-on. You want students to have an opportunity to experience. You want students to have an opportunity to see why this is meaningful in the real world context. If everything remains abstract to students, it's difficult. The more something becomes relatable to a student, the more they're likely to learn that concept. Students may lack effective reading skills that are needed to persevere and succeed when encountering a challenging text. Perseverance is key here. Now, I'm going to, and my former students who've had me for an in-class teacher know, sometimes I talk about topics that are beyond what's in a slide. There's a concept called self-efficacy. Let me write it down here. If I can, oops. Sorry about that, everyone. There's a concept called self-efficacy. In self-efficacy, you learn to have confidence that you can do something with success. Self-efficacy means, of course, I have confidence that I can do something. For instance, I have confidence that I have that I can do math very well, or I have confidence that I can do science very well. That relates very strongly to perseverance. And this is not on the slide, but it very much relates to what I'm talking about. For instance, a student with a high level of self-efficacy, efficacy is spelled self and then dash E-F-F-I-C-A-C-Y, if you want to look it up. Albert Bandura is best known as one of the theorists behind self-efficacy. Self-efficacy means that I have confidence to be a skilled reader. I have confidence that when I encounter challenging texts, I know how to use certain reading strategies to deal with that text. A student who has a high level of self-efficacy is more likely to persevere when they encounter challenging texts. A student with a low level of self-efficacy is more likely to give up, to say, I don't get it. There are 4 steps, and we'll go into this more in the class, but right now I'm previewing 4 steps in helping students build self-efficacy. One, and these are kind of I statements, but they need to be real, not just simply a matter of motivational speaking. One is I have the knowledge that it takes. In other words, I know what to do when I read. I know certain vocabulary. I know certain reading strategies. I have the knowledge. Number 2 is I have the skills that it takes. I have the skill to break down a complex sentence. I have the skill to not only know what these strategies are, but apply these strategies, these previewing strategies, these strategies to break difficult word down, these strategies to break words down into their roots and prefixes, suffixes, these strategies for previewing a text. I know how to apply these strategies. That's number 2. So number 1 is knowledge. Number 2 is application. Number 3 is I've been given good instruction from someone who is an expert. So that relates to your job as a teacher. The student needs to have confidence in you as a teacher. The student needs to know that you know what you're talking about, that you care about the material, that you care about that student's learning, that you care about that student's needs and interests, and it helps that the student can relate to you. It really helps that that student can relate to you in some way. Build that personal relationship with that student. If a student feels like they've had good mentoring, good modeling, good instruction, it really helps that student when that student builds confidence that they can do something. So that's number 3. We've gone through 3 things here in building a student's self-efficacy. 1 is knowledge, 2 is application, the 3rd is the teacher. 4th, and this is number 4 out of 4, and this is the biggie, this is where the rubber meets the road. 4th is I have overcome previous similar challenges and I have succeeded. In other words, practice. Overcoming challenges is key. A student may have knowledge, strategies, and have had a good teacher, but if that student does not have practice of overcoming difficult texts and making meaning out of the difficult texts, that student is still going to lack confidence in their ability to do so. So the more a student has practice with reading and applying these reading strategies, the more that student can build confidence. And what you want to do is you want to have a scaffolding type of approach where students encounter simplistic text at first if they're struggling to apply these reading strategies, but eventually up the ante. Eventually make it more and more difficult, but within reason. Don't let the student become frustrated and give up. Be there to monitor, be there to guide. As that student has experience in overcoming increasingly complex texts, and they have experience in overcoming challenges, they are going to build their self-efficacy, and that's extremely important in building their confidence. Okay, so here we go into effective content area literacy instruction. These are on this slide. These are important strategies you want to use as a teacher. Be explicit in your instruction while also providing supportive practice in effective comprehension strategies throughout diverse content areas. To be explicit means to be direct. It means to be exact. It means to not leave any room for the student to think about and ask, hey, wait a second, what exactly are you talking about? It means to, when you're teaching previewing strategies, teach them, okay, this is what the text exactly means. Okay, so theoretical models, for instance, on this book. Now, this is, of course, a higher level book than you would read with your middle school students. It would just simply happen to be sitting here by my side. This is one of the books I read for pleasure. I'm a little bit of a nerd. But if I was going to use this with my graduate students, I would talk about theoretical models in the process of reading. Now let's preview. What can we expect this book to probably be about? What is theory? What does theory mean? What does it mean in the context of science as opposed to everyday use, because you remember there is a difference. When we talk about everyday, a theory is okay, I have a guess. When we talk about science, you're talking about your best explanation based upon evidence and so when we talk about a theoretical model, you're talking about a construct to explain something. When we talk about processes, of course, you're talking about methods that people use. You're talking about the process of reading. So then we could say theoretical processes of reading and understanding it. What prediction can we make about this text? We're going to learn about theories in reading and explanatory models in reading about how students read better. What's the reading process like? And from there, how can we better help students read? That's an example of how I would work with that text if I'm working with even adult learners. And now hopefully you can see the context there. A more simple book that I can give you is just sitting right here. Earth Eyes Destination, and you can see Zhengzhou, China, including a history, the Zhengzhou. Here, I'll show it to you. So it's got a subhead: the Zhengzhou Confucius Temple, the remains of Song Dynasty, capital, the Zhengzhou Botanical Garden, and more. This is basically a tourist book. If you were using this book with students, you might talk about what does the picture say? What meaning can you make out of the picture? What does it mean to you that you've got aspects of symbolism from the Chinese flag contoured over this person's face? Earth Eyes Destinations, this is a company. What can we predict about that? When we talk about Zhengzhou, China, what kind of prior knowledge do we have? Zhengzhou, of course, is the city where my wife was born and raised. What kind of predictions can we make about that? And then you would break down the subtitle. So again, we're making predictions out of what's on the cover to predict what's going to be in the text. That's one reading strategy. You want to increase the amount and quality of open, sustained discussion of reading content. Discussion is extremely important. As a student discusses a text, they build meaning with each other, and different students in the room can help each other understand more complex topics. You might have an aha moment. Maybe a student didn't understand something at first, but then a peer might have understood it a little bit better, and something said by that peer might have that aha moment. And here's the thing: your students will relate to each other as peers in ways that they don't necessarily relate to you as a teacher, obviously. So sometimes that peer-to-peer conversation can be extremely helpful. Set and maintain high standards for the text, for conversation, for questions, for vocabulary. In other words, expectations are very important. If a student is struggling, don't take the attitude that just because that student is struggling, they can never get it. They might need help, they might need time, and it might not come overnight, but they can get it in most cases, of course. Teach essential content knowledge so students can master critical concepts. Again, don't expect mastery of a concept to happen just because you taught it. It's not as simple as I said it. Now you need to get it, and if you don't get it, you make an F. Please don't do that. The essential content knowledge needs to scaffold toward mastery. Again, I'm going through this a little bit quickly. Well, maybe not so quickly because it's already been 34 minutes. But this is basically an introduction. It's an introductory lecture. It's not meant to give you mastery either about all this stuff. We'll go through all of these strategies. Think of this as kind of a preview for key concepts you'll learn in this course. You want to teach comprehension strategies. The reader's use of strategies are ways of thinking and doing that reflect how experts in disciplines read and think. That's very key. Like I've said, there are certain reading strategies that students need to know, and some of these reading strategies can differ from discipline to discipline. For instance, when you are trying to do math, there are certain types of reading strategies and problem-solving strategies that you need to know. And like I've said, a key comment that I hear a lot from my wife, even with college students that she teaches, is that she gets frustrated because her students did not know or understand the basic reading strategies involved in math and the basic thinking strategies involved in math when they got to her course. What this means, and there's a reason I'm using this as an example, is that that's basic knowledge that her students should have learned back in middle school and high school. Think about that for a second. If you don't teach your students these basic skills in middle school or high school, it's going to set them up for challenges, obstacles for years to come. Comprehension strategies. This is a basic overview. Discussions to help students become more aware of their own cognitive processes and help them set a purpose for using comprehension strategies. It's important as a teacher for you to model and explain when, how, why to use certain strategies in text. Now, there's a difference, and we'll learn this as we go through the text, between strategies for understanding, for instance, phonics, phonemic awareness, which we'll learn more about, and comprehension. Within the big five of reading, we'll study that more. You've got, of course, phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. The ultimate goal in reading is comprehension, but if you're struggling in fluency means your speed, your pace, appropriate tone of reading. If you're struggling in that area, it's going to hinder you in comprehension. Your students need to have mastery of certain sets of strategies to help them understand the text. If they lack these strategies, they're probably going to lack success in your content area. And that's a big thing that I see people do in content areas. I remember back, for instance, this was an aha moment when I was a curriculum coordinator for a high school. I was working with a social studies teacher, a long-time social studies teacher. I say long time, it's kind of ironic. He was probably my current age, but this was 10 years ago. So I'm thinking about that. He seemed older than I seem now. That might seem ironic, but you'll learn how that's like as you age if you're 20. He spent a long time on his lectures, on his videos, the type of thing that social studies teachers do. But until I arrived, until he met me, he didn't know how to teach reading strategies at all. And so his students were really struggling on the texts, and his students were really struggling on the material. And he would say to me things like, this was, again, I was Mr. at the time, not Doctor at that time. Mr. Kearns, it's frustrating to me because I spent a long time on my lectures and I get really enthusiastic in my lectures and I really care about this material, but the students just aren't getting it. They aren't grasping it and they're bored. Now, thankfully, he avoided making the mistake that many teachers make, which is to assume that the reason a student is bored is because that student just simply doesn't care about learning or because that student just doesn't want to succeed. Oftentimes, the reason a student is bored is because they don't make a connection or because they're tuning out because they lack confidence in success. Again, that's self-efficacy for you. Think about the role that self-efficacy plays in perseverance. If you lack self-efficacy, you're more likely to lack perseverance. If you have self-efficacy, you're more likely to persevere. As he learned from me certain strategies to help his students become more strategic readers, his students started experiencing more success in his social studies class. And guess what? They also became more engaged. They started engaging in conversation. They started showing up to class more. They stopped being late as much. They stopped talking out of turn. He started having fewer disciplinary referrals to make. The thing about disciplinary referrals is oftentimes it's your fault as a teacher. We punish students, but we fail to think about what we're doing wrong ourselves as teachers. An engaged student, a confident student, is less likely to act out in class. Reading skills can help you minimize classroom disruptions. Think about that for a moment. Still with comprehension strategies. You want to think about opportunities for many meaningful opportunities for students to use comprehension strategies and receive feedback. Again, that's on this first point here. That means practice. That means, again, think about those 4 steps in building efficacy: knowledge, practice, the teacher modeling it, and of course, overcoming challenges. So many opportunities for practice, many opportunities to build your skill. You need to model the strategies, and you need to give students opportunity to overcome challenges with purposeful and meaningful feedback. Here's the thing about your feedback to students. Too many times I hear teachers giving the wrong type of feedback. And when I say wrong, I mean wrong in context. There's the type of feedback that builds self-efficacy, and there's the type of feedback that builds self-esteem. Those are 2 very different things. Self-esteem means, oh, look at you, you're so pretty, you're so smart, you can accomplish anything. Self-efficacy means that you can accomplish this specific task with success. Those are very different things. For instance, take me personally. I have fairly decent self-esteem. Without going, you don't know me well enough on these lectures for me to start making jokes about my self-esteem, areas where I'm confident or lack of confidence, but it's decent. But you ask me to do the type of things that my wife does, mathematical modeling and supply chain management, all that, I'm going to show a fairly low level of self-efficacy. That's because I lack confidence in my ability to do those certain tasks with success. For good reason. You ask me to do the type of mathematical modeling that my wife does, and I would fail. Think about that with your students. What can they do? What can they not do? They're going to give up if they don't think they can do something well. They're going to persevere if they think they can do something well, but they need opportunities to use these strategies with success and with feedback. This is where I come to the type of feedback that you're coming. A self-esteem comment that you can make to students. There's nothing wrong with self-esteem, just know the difference, because of course a student needs both self-esteem and self-efficacy. Self-esteem, you're smart. You can do anything you set your mind to. That goes towards self-esteem. Self-efficacy means, I like the strategy that you used. Here's what you specifically did. Explain to me why you did that. Explain to me how you solved that problem, and get into a conversation with that student about that student's thinking processes, and give that student meaningful, purposeful, specific feedback on those strategies. That's the difference. Self-esteem is vague. Self-efficacy feedback is specific. There are times for both. I don't want you to think that self-esteem is not valued. That's the last thing I'm saying. There are times for both, but know the difference. Gradual transfer of responsibility from implementing comprehension strategies to from the teacher to the student. That gets into the difference between you talking about a strategy and modeling a strategy and the student actually doing it. Both are important. It's important for you to model. It's important for you to teach. It's important for you to lecture. At times, I hate the word lecture being overused because, for one thing, as we'll learn in the class further on, there's different meanings of the word lecture. And the word lecture, it's not that it's bad, it's just that it's misunderstood. But there are times for that, but there are also times for practice. We'll learn further in this class about the I do it, we do it, you do it approach. That approach is often misunderstood. You've probably heard it before, but in a nutshell, the teacher demonstrates something and teaches something. That's the I do it. We do it is we do it as a group. We practice this comprehension strategy as a group. And you do it is you apply it on your own with practice, meaningful practice on a set of problems. And then, of course, feedback, formative in the process of learning type of assessment that you give the student your best, most specific feedback that you can. And of course, this loop, I do it, we do it, you do it. Okay, discussions are so important. Discussions about text have the potential to increase students' ability to understand what they read. Don't leave out the importance of discussion. I see this too many times. Teachers will assign something, they'll ask the students to read, they may assign it for homework, they'll talk about what the student got wrong, what the student didn't go wrong, they'll maybe go over the right, wrong answers, they'll give the student a grade, but they lack discussions. Discussions are so important. Feedback, specific feedback, conversation, meaning making. Make your classroom one where there's freedom for risk, freedom for being wrong without being ridiculed. Your students aren't always going to be right. Your students are going to make mistakes. I've got news for you. You're going to make mistakes. I've made plenty of mistakes in my career, whether it is poorly pronouncing words, as you probably heard in this video, or whether it is rookie mistakes when I was a first-year teacher. Wow, did I make some rookie mistakes as a first-year teacher? You're going to make them too. It's okay to be honest. If you have an open conversational classroom where mistakes are not ridiculed, but mistakes are opportunities to build toward success, that's going to be a classroom where your students are going to learn a little bit more. This may date me, but to use that famous quote from the Batman movie, why do we fall, Bruce? It's to learn to pick ourselves back up. Same thing with your students. When students struggle or fail, it's an opportunity. It's a learning opportunity. Discussions can increase a student's ability to think critically. And that's very important. Silence is not what you want in the classroom. So many times, I mean, obviously that's a broad statement. There are times for silence, of course, like when a class is taking a multiple choice test. But so many times I've seen when an assistant principal might walk into a room and see this really lively class full of loud discussion, debate, and all that stuff, and give the teacher a demerit, a bad mark, because it looks like the class is out of control. There are times when lively discussions get lively. Students might get engaged, and when a student gets engaged, especially a middle school student gets engaged, yeah, they get a little bit lively. There's nothing wrong with liveliness if it's meaningful and purposeful, and if learning is taking place. That's the key. Learning needs to be taking place. Discussions can increase student engagement and motivation. Think very carefully about how you engage, how you motivate. Engagement in The simplest possible way I can define it for my purposes in this class means that you are focused on that activity. Your attention is applied to that activity. You're not distracted from doing anything else. Motivation, in a nutshell, means I want to do it. I want to do this activity. Now, as you guys are finding, I go a little bit broader than a PowerPoint when I give these discussions. That's why it's very important. I want you guys to actually listen to my recordings, not just simply expect that reading through the PowerPoint is enough. For instance, in engagement relates to a concept we'll learn more about called flow theory. Go ahead and look that up, flow theory. Flow theory is a concept in psychology where you are so purposefully engaged in what you're doing that you might lose track of time, and you're using your skill to your optimum potential. You want to shoot for opportunities where your students might potentially experience flow. They might potentially be so deeply engaged in their reading or their math or their science that they look up at the clock and wow, 40 minutes passed by, I didn't know. They're not distracted. Motivation. There are two ways of motivating a person in general. There's extrinsic and there's intrinsic. Extrinsic means external rewards, grades, pay for doing a job if you're talking about adults, positive feedback, negative feedback. Those are all forms of extrinsic motivation. The last thing I want you to think that I'm saying is that one form of motivation is valid, the other form of motivation is not, because they both can be helpful. Obviously, grades can motivate a person, and obviously grades count. Obviously, positive feedback from a teacher or a parent or a peer can be motivational. But if you're relying on a student to engage in material, but that student has zero intrinsic motivation, then that student is more likely to give up, especially if there's a certain lack of extrinsic factor. Intrinsic motivation means I want to do it for my own sake. I find it meaningful. I want to find it purposeful, even enjoyable for its own sake. For instance, with reading, I like reading this text because I enjoy it and because I see meaning in it. I see purpose in it. That's what you want in your students. You want intrinsic motivation. Discussions can improve students' conceptual understanding and learning. And ideally, as you learn to teach, you will hopefully learn how to give little verbal cues, feedback, to help the student think about the why, the how, think a little bit more deeply about a concept. Go from one level of Bloom's taxonomy to the next. Go from application to evaluation, for example, as you discuss concepts. I need to turn off this phone. Okay, so in case you're wondering what that is, those are fellow people trying to call me friends and people for my job. Hopefully you don't get too annoyed with that. I'll learn to set off my phone in future PowerPoints. I wasn't expecting people to call me. Okay, these are ways of increasing motivation. Give students more choice of text and assignments to build their autonomy. Now, obviously, when I talk about these strategies, not every strategy will work in all contexts, and it varies. That's the thing about teaching, is that not every strategy can or should be used at all times in all places with all students. You want to think very purposefully about what you're doing, why you're doing it. But as a general rule of thumb, this is one reason why classroom libraries are important, for instance, with your students. If your student is able to choose what book to read, they're more likely to be motivated to read that book. You want to create opportunities for students to interact with each other in pairs or in small groups with shared focus on understanding a text. That's dialogue. That's meaningful dialogue. That's that opportunity for fun in talking about a text. Provide students with a variety of interesting texts that reflect diverse interests of your adolescents, or in some cases even preteens, depending on what age you're teaching. Um, Diversity of interest is very important. When I was a middle schooler, of course, it probably won't surprise you too much, some of my interests, baseball, science. I was a huge baseball fan. I was living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania at the time, a major fan of the Pittsburgh Pirates. Hopefully that doesn't turn some of you against me because I know that this is Houston Astros country. But along with other teams, but especially Houston Astros and, of course, Texas Rangers are not that far nearby. But again, I was very interested in that, so opportunities to learn about that mattered. They helped motivate me. I was also interested in concepts of history. So if you give me those sort of choices to read in a book, I was more likely to find it interesting. Focus students on personally important and interesting learning goals. Goals are so important. Why am I reading this? What do I hope to get out of this? Ideally, if you help through dialogue with your student, set some shared goals. Here's what I hope to see as a teacher. Here's what I hope to see you accomplish. Do you agree or disagree? Let's co-create these set of shared goals. That'll help your student in terms of motivation. Okay, nearly done. Thank you for being patient. You want to build on prior knowledge. The reader's knowledge includes experiences brought into the classroom. All of your students will have different sets of life experiences, of course, and in some cases, these life experiences will be very, very different depending on that student's age, gender, cultural background, ethnic background, whatever. They might be very, very different, socioeconomic background. And the more you get to know a student, as well as that student's family, culture, avoiding stereotypes, mind you, please avoid those stereotypes, those sweeping generalizations. You can learn to bring that knowledge into helping a student understand a text a little bit better. We'll learn in this class more about a concept called funds of knowledge. Funds of knowledge, like banking funds. Louis Moll, M-O-L-L, is widely associated with funds of knowledge if you want to learn more about that. Funds of knowledge means that a student's family and community and culture has a certain fund of knowledge, like a banking fund of knowledge that you can tap into as a teacher. And that if you draw upon that to inform your curriculum and inform your teaching, then your teaching will become more rich and your students will become more engaged and they'll learn more. Knowledge includes the multiple ways in which a student learns. Obviously, with multiple ways of learning, we're talking about mathematical, kinesthetic, verbal, linguistic. Some students have, I'll put it this way, higher self-efficacy in one way of learning than another way of learning. Now notice what I just said. I didn't say that a student has higher aptitude. I said they have higher self-efficacy. If you have higher self-efficacy, that means that you're going to persevere a little bit more, and it means that you likely do show higher aptitude in a certain area. But here's the thing, I've seen many teachers neglect certain ways of learning, the kinesthetic, for instance. And as a result, those ways of learning are not well developed among students. Therefore, if you give a student a test later on in life about what's their best way of learning, they'll identify certain ways of learning with which they have practiced, they've got more experience. And they're going to be right, that is their best way of learning, but it's more about practice than it is about natural aptitude. Think about that for a second. Practice matters. Experience matters. If you never have practice in kinesthetic or mathematical ways of meaning making, then you're going to lack efficacy and lack skill in that particular way of meaning making. Knowledge includes how the reader constructs meaning while reading in a specific discipline. We've talked about that quite a bit. You want to build toward mastery of skills. We've talked about metacognition. Metacognition is the ability to think about and control the thinking process before, during, and after reading. A metacognitive, purposeful reader is going to be very strategic in their reading. On the other hand, a reader that does not have much metacognition is going to give up pretty quickly. They'll just simply say, I don't get it, and they will not know how to comprehend a text. Teacher, I need help. Metacognition deals with have I previewed this text? What steps do I need to do? What strategies do I need to use? Am I using the right strategies for this right type of text? Students who have learned metacognitive skills can plan and monitor their comprehension, adapting it and modifying it for their reading. In other words, it is something that is transferable from one classroom and one context to the next. Transference is also very, very key. Okay, finally, here we come to our discussion board post. I'm going to email this to you as well, because obviously I've been talking for an hour. It's possible not every student will have made it through this discussion for 1 hour. I want this discussion board posted by today is August 26th. I'm going to post this video today. I want this discussion board turned in by September 2nd, no later than midnight. Ideally, I would love it if you guys would comment. Now, if there is any kind of technological glitch, because remember, I'm still getting used to the Blackboard system. If there's, for some reason, because I'm trying to post discussion boards, if for some reason whatsoever you have a hard time posting these discussion boards, it's okay to email it to me. I'll still give you full credit. And you can see in the syllabus how much discussion boards are worth 10 points. Your journal articles are worth 30 points. I want you to watch this video clip that I've posted here that follows. Discuss instructional strategies that are used by this teacher that might help students become more skilled readers. This clip is very important. Now, if you have a hard time with this clip, email me. I'll send this clip to you. I'll email the clip to you if you have any kind of hard time with it whatsoever. Hopefully you ought to be able to just simply point click and it'll open up. I do want you to see real world context of good teaching in action. That's why I include videos with every from YouTube and other sources with every time that I post one of these videos. And I also want you to have different voices and not just mine as you go through this class. Okay, so that was our lecture number 1. I'll try to do better next time. I'll shut off my phone, for instance. Hopefully you guys don't mind that too much. Hopefully it wasn't too distracting. And hopefully you enjoy this class. Have a good day.